Hi everyone, today I'm reading The Ghost of Fossil Glen, chapter 22. That night, before going to bed, Allie went from room to room, making sure the windows were closed and latched, and the doors were bolted tight. Her father saw her and asked teasingly, "What's up, Al? Afraid of the boogeyman?" Allie looked into her father's kind, laughing eyes and hesitated. How could she begin to tell him that she was afraid of a man she'd never met, a man who was a murderer, who had figured out that she was the only person who knew he was a murderer, and that she had found out about it because she'd read the diary of a dead girl? "No," she said finally. Her voice came out funny, high-pitched and quivering. "I was just checking." "I always lock up, sweetie. You run on up to bed. It's late." Allie dreaded going to her room alone. Reluctantly, she turned to climb the stairs. "Didn't you forget something?" said her dad. He stood with his arms out, and Allie ran to give him a hug. She clung fiercely for a moment before letting go, and he said softly, "Everything okay, Allie cat?" "Yes," said Allie. What? "Just make sure everything's locked, okay?" "You bet," said her dad, giving her a kiss. "You can count on it." Allie checked her desk to make sure the diary was where she had left it. It was safe in the secret drawer, which Raymond Gagne obviously knew nothing about. Okay, she thought, he can't get the diary, and Dad locked up the house, so he can't get me. She repeated it over and over to herself. He can't get me, he can't get me, he can't get me. But even with the lamp on her bureau burning brightly, Allie spent most of the night staring wide-eyed at the cracks in the ceiling, stiffening at every sound she imagined she heard. She longed for daylight, but found that instead of looking forward to the field trip the next day, she dreaded returning to the Glen. She could pretend she was sick, but that was no good. Her parents would have to go to work, and the idea of staying home alone all day was far worse than going to the Glen with her class. She prayed for rain. She must have slept because she awakened to bright sunlight streaming through her window. It was a beautiful day. So sorry. Excuse me. The field trip was on. Okay, she told herself. She was going back to the Glen. What did they say about falling off a horse? You're supposed to get right back on. Besides, she loved the Glen. She'd been climbing those cliffs ever since she was a little older than Michael. She wasn't going to let Gag Me stop her. She got out of bed and dressed in shorts, a t-shirt, and hiking boots. "Mom," she asked at breakfast, "could you drive me to school today?" "Sure, I guess so. Why, do you have a lot to carry?" "My backpack's really heavy," Allie said. "Okay, be ready in 5 minutes," said her mother. As they drove towards school, Allie looked nervously for signs of Raymond Gagne. She felt a little silly. What was she looking for, anyway? A mysterious black sedan? A lurking figure wearing a raincoat and sporting a big mustache? The image her mind created was a combination of Lucy's description and every movie villain Allie had ever seen. To her relief, no one and nothing out of the ordinary appeared on the way to school. Once in the parking lot, she thanked her mother and ran quickly into the building. When Allie got to her classroom, Hoover was already there. With a red bandana tied around her neck and her tail wagging madly, she was prancing happily around the room, sniffing and exploring. "Hey, Hoover," shouted Joey. "That's my lunch bag." He grabbed the brown paper bag from Hoover's mouth and gave her a playful pat on the back. As always, Allie was enchanted by Hoover. She would have loved to own a dog, but couldn't because Michael was allergic to pet hair. "Come here, Hoover," she called. "I brought something for you." She reached into her backpack and took out a bag of pretzels and held them up to show Mr. Henry. "Is it okay if I give her one?" she asked. "One," said Mr. Henry. "And that's it. The vet said she's got to go on a diet." "Poor Hoover," said Allie, feeding the big dog the pretzel. Hoover thumped her tail gratefully. Allie rubbed Hoover's long, soft ears and whispered, "No more snacks for you, girl. Doctor's orders." Mr. Henry flicked the lights on and off, and the class grew quiet. Even Hoover sat looking at him attentively. "Well," he said, "you all look ready for our excursion. Don't forget to bring paper and something to write on, and of course your lunches. Those of you with field guides, be sure to bring them too. Do we have one for identifying birds?" Julie Horowitz held up a book. "Mammals?" "Yep." "Reptiles and amphibians, plants, fossils, trees, and insects," said Dub. "What about fish?" asked Mr. Henry. "I got it," answered Allie. "Okay, that ought to do it. Everybody ready? Let's go." As the class trooped across the meadow to the Glen, Allie made sure that she was out of earshot of Karen and Pam while she told Dub what had happened to her at the cliffs the afternoon before. Dub's eyes grew wide. "It's Gag Me," he said. "I told you. He's figured out who you are, and now he's after you." You think so? Said Allie with a shiver. Then she admitted, so do I. I've been really spooked ever since. It was so creepy. I'm sure I heard footsteps, Dub. But I don't know. I never actually saw anybody. Mr. Henry was leading the way down the path to a place where the slope of the cliff was more gradual and easier to manage. Years before, someone had tied a thick rope from tree to tree to form a handrail along a narrow trail that descended to the bottom of the glen. Now, take your time and be careful, Mr. Henry warned. These cliffs are slippery. They're made of what kind of rock? Shale, the class answered in unison. Right, and it's very crumbly, so watch your feet. Allie had to smile at Mr. Henry's caution. He was right, of course, but compared to the cliffs she'd climbed earlier in the week, the path was a piece of cake. One by one, piece of cake, that's an idiom. What does it mean? It means it was easy. It doesn't have anything to do with cake, right? That's why it's an idiom. While Allie and Dub waited their turn to go down, Allie walked a little farther up the path to the place where she figured she'd be standing the day before. Sure enough, there were the imprints of her sneakers, clearly outlined in the mud that was beginning to dry after the rain. There were prints where she had stood still, listening, and deep, smeared prints where she had taken off running. No more than 10 feet from where she had stood were several prints much larger than hers. Dub, she cried, look! Dub ran over and studied the prints carefully. Well, that proves that he said somebody was on the path with you, and those shoes don't belong to any kid. Look how big they are. They stared wide-eyed at each other, neither one saying what Allie knew was in both their minds. Come on, you guys, called Brad. We're leaving you in the dust. There's another idiom. What does that mean if you're leaving someone in the dust? It means they're going on ahead and you're lagging behind. Quickly, Allie and Dub walked back to join the others, glad it was broad daylight and they were with Mr. Henry and the group and not alone. Most of the kids were already down by the creek, lifting up rocks and peering into pools. Allie could hear Joey's voice booming. Hey, I found a crayfish! Julie yelled out that she could see fish near the bottom of the falls. I got the fish book, Allie called back. I'll be right there. She and Dub joined Julie on the creek bank near the small waterfall. There in a clear, deep pool was a group of fish. They were all facing into the rushing water. They're called suckers, said Dub. Yeah, agreed Allie. But is that their real name? I'll look them up and find out. She and Dub and Julie flipped through the pages of the field guide and read about white suckers, which each spring swam from the lake up into the streams to spawn. Wait, that one over there is different, said Allie, pointing to a larger fish, poised by itself in the shadow of a submerged log. They crept closer to get a better look, and then the fish darted quickly to the other side of the pool, flashing silvery stripes on its side. A rainbow trout, shouted Dub. Mr. Henry, a rainbow! Mr. Henry, an avid fisherman, came over to look. It's a beauty, he said admiringly. You know, that is one of the few streams around here that's clean enough for trout to spawn in. We should put that in our letter to the owner of this place, said Brad. You're right, said Mr. Henry. If they start digging foundations for 50 houses up above, there'll be a lot of erosion from these cliffs. All that mud will make a mess of the stream. Hey, a voice hollered excitedly. Everybody, come here, look at this. Cool, what is it? It's some kind of bird. It's a duck, you dodo. Oh yeah, what kind? Where's the book? It's just sitting there. Why doesn't it fly away? Mr. Henry, Dub, and Julie headed over to where most of the kids in the class were gathered, looking down at a nest in the bottom of a tree. Allie continued to stare into the pool of suckers, distracted by the thought of how awful it would be if the waters of the clear, beautiful pool were muddied and spoiled. Would that mean the fish could no longer spawn? If they couldn't safely lay their eggs here, where would they go? There would be no little baby suckers, no small trout to return to the lake and grow big. She heard Joey shout, It's a mallard duck, and no wonder she doesn't fly. She's got babies. Come away from there, everybody, said Mr. Henry. We don't want to bother her. Allie was starting over to see the ducklings when she noticed that Hoover had strayed from the group and was heading rapidly upstream. Hoover, she called, come back here. But Hoover, intent on some canine mission, ignored her. Hoover, Allie called again. Hoover disappeared around the bend. Uh-oh, said Allie, remembering the cow manure episode and the class's promise to keep an eye on Hoover if she came along. Allie set off to bring her back.